Well, good morning and welcome back. This is Reframing, Rethinking Existing Collections in the Current Moment. My name is Lauren Gutterman, and I'm an assistant professor of American Studies, History, and Women's and Gender Studies here at UT Austin. And I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today. So the formatting will be the same. I'll introduce our speakers. They'll make their presentations, and then we'll come together for a conversation and open it up to the audience as well. So first, Dr. Anne Cvetkovich is director of the Pauline Jewett Institute for Women's and Gender Studies at Carleton University. She has also been Ellen Clayton Garwood Centennial Professor of English, Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, and inaugural Director of LGBTQ Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of several books, including, most recently, Depression, A Public Feeling, and she's working on a new project about the state of LGBTQ archives and the creative use of them by artists to produce counter-archives and interventions in public history. Dr. Clare Hayes-Brady is a lecturer in American literature at the University College in Dublin, where she works in contemporary literature with interests in gender, philosophy, imaginaries of illness, death, the post-human, and embodiment. Her book, The Unspeakable Failures of David Foster Wallace, was published in 2016 with Bloomsbury. And finally, Ms. Theresa Sotto, who is Associate Director of Academic Programs at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, where she oversees educational programming for university, family, and K-12 audiences. She's been working in education and the arts since 2001, and her work emphasizes social justice, equity, and inclusive practices. So thank you, and I think Dr. Cvetkovich, if you'd like to go first.
Can we get my, there we go. That's good. I'm very honored to be here, particularly because I'm not someone who's professionally affiliated with an archive or collection, but works as a scholar on archives. I started a new job in January, and I'm very excited to be back at UT after many years here, including collaborations with various of the people speaking here. And I'm already extremely excited to see the conversation so far, and I want to thank Steve and Danielle for inviting me, and was especially excited to see Theresa Polk just before me, from over at the Benson, since we've also worked together on a human rights and archives working group here. And I'm very happy to see conversations happening across the campus that I think are very important for UT going forward, and very exciting for archival studies and these questions of cultural stewardship. I think one of the hats I'm probably wearing as part of this conversation, as we weave together various threads, is someone who works in LGBTQ studies and has, even though I'm trained as a literary scholar, ended up as something of a public historian because of my interest in community-based archives. So I think 2 points I want to make, and because I work by juxtaposition, my one case is at the end of a series. I don't know if I'll get through all of them, but I particularly, and it's germane to the conversation already, wanted to bring into the conversation collections like the Lesbian Herstory Archives community-based collection in Brooklyn, which has remained steadfastly autonomous, not connected to institutional support for its 40-plus years of existence, and which collects, in the words of co-founder Joan Nessel, anything that a lesbian ever touched is game for inclusion as part of the historical record. In fact, it's a place where deposits are welcome, that kind of self-nomination of here's what I've collected and here's why it matters is embraced as part of the community-based spirit. I, as part of my work of thinking about what I called in my title, I want to go back documents of queer intimacy from community-based archives to university collections. I want to also put on the table for our discussion, I think it's relevant to Joyce Maynard's keynote last night, the question of intimacy and sexuality in the archives and why it matters and why the work of LGBTQ studies, queer theory, makes a case for that in a way that is relevant for all of us and that might open up answers to some of the difficult ethical questions that came up last night, for example. There's also issues of custodianship and stewardship insofar as even as community-based archives have been enormously successful, they are also fragile and often have meager resources. So what's been exciting for me and part of my research is also to see increasing collaborations between community-based archives and public institutions. And it's interesting that we have someone from the Hammer, because I've been working just up the street at UCLA and studying its partnership with the June Mazer Lesbian Archive, which is a community-based archive based in Hollywood. Los Angeles is also the site for a really important collaboration between the One Archives and USC, where the One Archives are now part of the collections of the USC libraries. The Mazer has remained, it's a bit like the post-custodial model that Theresa was describing for the Guatemalan Police Archives. Much of the Mazer's collection has come into UCLA's special collections, but also remains part of the Mazer's collection. And it does create these complicated logistics of collaboration that are also worth it in terms of building community partnerships. So I've been studying what happens when, what is it like to look at those collections in the community-based space, and what is it like to look at them in the UCLA special collections, and what does it mean, and this would be part of my contribution to discussion as well, to have different kinds of collections come into, I think even a few modest acquisitions can really transform how we think about our existing collections. So looking at June Mazer's ephemera alongside of, for example, Susan Sontag's early journals can be a very interesting juxtaposition, and is also a way of putting, this was my title, ordinary lesbians into special collections so that more elite figures can be in conversation with them, and so that we can think about, I joke that I always start back asswards in the finding aid of even famous people, looking not necessarily for the manuscripts, but looking for the ephemera, looking for the letters, looking for the personal photographs, not out of necessarily a kind of prurient gossipy sense, although gossip is a form of queer archival method, I think, but just because personal photographs, for example, can be very revealing not only of individual lives, but also of collective formations. So these kinds of materials from Esther Bentley's collections, which now sit at UCLA, and that too is for me very significant, that she is not someone who's famous in the conventional sense or has published books, but in fact, her collections becomes part of what she gave to the world is her photographs, her letters, her notes, etc. And that looking at these kinds of collections where even ordinary people have often been very self-conscious about archiving themselves because they understand the historical significance of their efforts, for example, to live lives openly as lesbians or gay people, particularly in the period before Stonewall and before a more active political movement, that these are important documents, these collective gatherings of people. So again, these are not just personal documents, but they are documents of social worlds. This I include just because it's Esther as collector, that we see how people are collectors or archivists, particularly when they feel like their lives are not well documented. This is one of her lovers whose collection is also there, where you start to piece together these intimate connections that, again, are often social ones as well. And I wanted to juxtapose some of these kinds of materials in the mazer with what it has meant for me to bring my knowledge of these community-based collections to my work in the HRC. So thanks to actually a lot of people here, I was able to teach a class in queer archives a couple of years ago that resulted in a small exhibition that was outside the reading room and then also was part of the exhibition space down below, curated by my students. And we focused on queer intimacies and focused on materials like artifacts from Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas' household, which might seem insignificant compared to, say, the manuscripts of Stein's literary productions, but are also a track or a clue, the recipes, the roses, a rose is a rose, cocktail napkin, to the salons that Stein and Toklas famously hosted, and through which a social world of literary modernisms that are quite queer were formed. So for me, these ephemeral artifacts are an important part of the HRC's collections, and viewing them through the lens of an interest in queer forms of sociality brings them into view. Personal photographs also are endlessly fascinating, looking at Radcliffe Hall and Una Troubridge and their dogs, their pets, again, not just the written record. Personal photographs or vernacular photographs are also something that I think move across social scales and hierarchies. So looking at them as a genre of intimacy is very important. I've been especially interested in the Sylvia Beach, Adrienne Meunier collections. It's a very small collection, and it's only here because of the interest in James Joyce at the HRC. But to see Beach and Meunier, Beach famously having facilitated the publication of Ulysses, but to focus more explicitly on the relationship between Beach and Meunier, or to see James Joyce at Meunier's family home, these are documents that are very special, not just in terms of illuminating the social networks around James Joyce, but also lesbian cultures of modernist Paris that are part of the reason we have these more famous literary cultures. So this is one of the ways in which I think more dialogue between a more popular view from below of social intimacies can also operate in dialogue with the kind of legacy holdings that collections like the HRC are noted for. Here's Sylvia Beach at home. This is where, to me, Beach is like a counterpart to the ordinary lesbians going about their business. There's all kinds of interesting gender stuff here. Just for interest of speed, I'm not going to dwell, but this is a really, for me, very lovely set of images. So in some ways, I suppose my argument could be construed as a pitch for LGBTQ inclusion as a way that would also allow us to explore intimacy and sexuality in ways that I think we should be doing across the board. But I did want to also put on the table the ways in which this is a very ambivalent process. So I don't think we can solve the problem of, say, diversity and inclusion just through forms of inclusion or adding collections. I think we have to think very critically about what it means to be in and out of institutions. And so I do also continue to carry the spirit of lesbian history archives and its kind of steadfast refusal to partner with mainstream institutions. It's partly also because in thinking juxtapositionally, I have also gained a lot from thinking about indigeneity in the archives. I've done some work at UBC's Museum of Anthropology just to see what's in their collections. Partly out of an awareness of the way in which Indigenous people have often not been well served by modes of collecting, which have dispersed their stuff all across the world, and often don't want to be collected. So to see something like this, this set of photographs by Beverly Brown, who was, as a young child, in the St. Michael's Indian Residential School and was given a camera by her father to take to the school with her, and she had to send the film back home in order to have it developed. These photographs have very sort of vulnerably landed in these archives. They're a beautiful example of the way in which the personal photograph can be an important mode of documentation of what are histories of genocide, of trauma, of violence, and testify to modes of survival and resilience in that context. But I've had a chance to look at, I used this image because it was part of a public exhibition on the Indian Residential School, but I've looked at the other materials, and there are some that are also blocked from view, even for researchers. And the only reason they're there is because Beverly Brown's daughter is a curator at UBC, and suggested that the materials come into the collections after the exhibition that was part of Canada's efforts to make good on the promise of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's results. So there's a lot of interest now in Canada in these kinds of collections, but they're only there as a result of the very personal care and collaboration of a mother and daughter. And I have felt very just cautious or careful about what it means to do research with them. And I'll leave you with one last example that's, again, these are strange juxtapositions in a way to put Indigenous archives and queer archives alongside one another, but I think that's what we need to do. I mean, I think we saw it in the previous panel, to have the Guatemalan Police Archive sitting alongside of a conversation about Ginsberg and Kafka. We need to connect those dots, even in places where they also seem very, these are very big leaps. This is a collection at Cornell, which has human sexuality collections, of Robert Lynch, who was a gay African-American man who died of AIDS in the 90s and who wanted his materials to find their way into an archive. He was trained at Harvard, had a legal degree from Harvard, but late in life returned home to North Carolina. He was a would-be poet who was never able to publish his work. He approached Harvard about taking his collections, and they would not. Cornell took his collections just before he died because they were interested in collecting LGBTQ work, especially in the early 90s in the wake of HIV/AIDS crisis, and a desire to preserve the work of people who were dying. And one of the things that he personally handed to Brenda Marston, the curator of the Cornell collections, was this pillowcase on the right with slides of men he had had relationships with. They're quite sexually explicit. They're also very personal. He wanted them in the collection. They, again, create a really interesting set of ethical issues for whether and how to display images that are also, although under in his possession, or images he took, of people who may still be alive, who may or may not know that their images are in a public archive. So again, even for purposes of a presentation like this, I've been unsure whether to show any of these images. And are we being filmed? Is this being filmed? So I think maybe I won't. I have one where you don't see a head, but these are complicated. And Lynch also was an important self-archiver. I put men, quilts, and and plants, because in his collections you see all these ephemeral papers, the same way you do for more famous people. A lot of I'm interested in the collecting of live material inside the archive. How can that sort of erotic intimacy of relationships with other men also be connected to the very intimate and erotic ways in which we collect materials for archives? I want to make that connection. He also was very avid in trying to preserve and collect folk art of the African-American communities in North Carolina where he lived. And so again, I think it's very interesting to connect this kind of preservation with the way in which he wanted to preserve his intimate relations. So I'll stop there. I think that's plenty. Thanks.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yes, I have a tendency to speak quite quickly that I'm aware of, and an accent that may be a little soft for some people. So if you need me to slow down or back up, I will not be offended. Do let me know. This is it in reverse, more or less. I'm probably not going to say any of that, actually. So I've been listening, really fascinated by this morning's papers, and have totally recalibrated everything I'm going to say. So just sort of ignore what's on the screen. So I, like Anne, I come from a sort of a different background, although even more different in this case. My work is largely non-archival. I work on David Foster Wallace, among others, and I work on David Foster. You may have noticed that I'm not a white man, so it's unusual that I work on Wallace. And this is something that I was at a conference in 2009. Somebody asked a question about gender, and honest to God, every head in the room turned to me. It's like, you're a girl, you talk about gender, guys. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, and one of the things that I want to talk about, for those of you not familiar with Wallace, he's been a bit of a sort of a cultural touchstone recently in terms of the Me Too movement. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to read and to teach and to, in some ways, curate Wallace as a feminist scholar. So that's more or less sort of what I want to do here. To give you a sense of sort of the structure that I had thought about, I'm going to begin by giving you a little context. Some of you will be familiar with Wallace, some maybe less so. I'm not going to dwell particularly. And I want to talk about reconciling critical work as a literary scholar. So the sort of curation that I do is quite different to the sort of the work of archiving and information professional that you guys do. But I want to talk a bit about the overlap and how those things can scaffold each other. And I want to think a little bit about some of the practical questions. And it strikes me on an aside that the religious language that I've heard this morning, veneration and canonization, is the one that keeps coming up. Stephen talked about veneration in his opening address, and that really struck a chord. I want to talk about canonization and the institutional imprimaturs that allow us to solidify these reputations. I think one of the things about working in contemporary information, contemporary culture, is that we get to watch this happen in real time and be part of that, which I think is quite interesting. So, for those of you not familiar with Wallace, his archive is here at the Ransom Centre, which is really the only reason I came over. I'm just so excited. He's best known for Infinite Jest, which is 1,100 pages long and is more of a weapon than a book. He was a MacArthur Fellowship, and when he died in 2008, he was really venerated, is precisely the word, as a kind of this sort of voice of a generation. There have been in recent years both a critical and a cultural sort of backlash against his work that I've been part of. Most importantly, for what I want to talk about today, Wallace had a documented history of abusive behaviour in intimate relationships, quite a violent temper, and was known as a predatory figure in some ways in his classes as well. What I really want to talk about is how his writing engages both in and with these practices, and so I'm interested in the relationship, the borders between what we know of the life and what we know of the work. So that's where my work he liked dogs, which you can see there. That's one of his dogs. So what I'm interested in today is the ethical entanglements. So I work as a reader, a critic, and a teacher. I am not an archivist or curator by training, or really by inclination, if you saw my filing system. But I think that particularly when we talk about criticism and teaching, that the work that I do, that I try to do, overlaps with the work that you do. And there is a hidden category here that I think, I suppose, activist is sort of the closest term in terms of working towards justice and working towards sort of ideas of reframing these conversations. And some of the sort of divided but complementary questions that we have to consider when we talk about engaging with these problematic figures. And I forgive the term problematic; it hides a multitude of sins, but it's the most capacious one I have. I think all of these largely come down really to resources of various kinds. How much time do we have? How much space in our brains do we have? How much theory do we have? How much physical space? How much money do we have? What are the constraints within which we're operating? And in that, have completely lost my place here. Within that, I think it's important to think about what is reasonably possible in the ethical decisions that we make. So this is my attractive picture of the silhouetted artist. I'm a feminist scholar, and one of the things that I get asked a lot is, how can you justify reading Wallace, teaching Wallace, engaging critically with Wallace, knowing what we know about his behaviours, his abusive relationships, his violent temper, etc. What ethical obligations do we have, and what options are open to us? Do we have an obligation to disengage from work created by bad people? Caravaggio, probably not a guy you necessarily want to have a drink with. Shakespeare abandoning his family at least once. Mailer stabbed his wife. Burroughs accidentally killed his wife. To go back to another figure that was mentioned earlier. What is the distinction? Where do we draw the line between an author's behaviour and their work? What is important? Wallace's work, whether you like it or not, is undeniably important for understanding contemporary literature, for understanding contemporary culture. And as a consequence, for me, the value of engagement is greater than the value of disengagement for reasons that I'll explain in brief. My work focuses on gender and sexuality. It's important also to consider questions of ethnicity, of race, of queer studies, of disability and embodiment that also arise in these conversations about Wallace. I'm not going to focus on them here. Brief content note for the next slide, which just takes a passage from Wallace's work, just to give you a sense of where I, as a literary scholar, operate. Because I'm not a biographically driven critic. So I just wanted to give you a sense of where Wallace's work engages in this kind of toxic masculinity that we see in his behaviour. I'm not going to go through all of this, don't worry. But it's a brief example of the closing of one of his stories, brief interview number 20 from the middle collection, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. It's pretty grim. This is a story about a rape that is then recounted at a distance of several frames. It's a story about ownership of narrative. It's a story about the power struggles in language. But what happens right at the end, you can see this longer passage here, is the narrator devolves into an extraordinary misogynistic rant. And it is signalled in the kind of images of possession, the expectations of power dynamics and relationship behaviours that you can see highlighted a little bit further. I'd fallen in love with her. I believed she could save me. These kinds of narratives that will be familiar from popular culture and from ideas of sort of romance. What I'm interested in is how Wallace's work and what we have here at the archive can draw a line between individual personal violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, temper, hot tempers, and so on. How that line is drawn to histories of social violence that we can see, I think, more broadly in this sort of work, and I think the archive can facilitate that in really important ways. I'm not going to go through all of this, but in brief, the two paths that seem open, or the obvious paths, are to disengage, and this is something that Professor Amy Hungerford has written quite persuasively about with regard to Wallace specifically. That I don't have time. I'm not going to read Wallace. I'm not going to assign Wallace. I think that this is a valid choice as a reader, certainly, although I have questions about whether it reduces art to a commercial transaction. But as a critic, I think that it is hampered, again, by that question of resources. If we choose as critics to disengage, who is going to know that we are disengaging for these reasons? How do we perform that disengagement? How do we perform our silence around these problematic figures? I don't have an answer to that. I think that it's difficult, but also I think it's a conversation worth having. Again, I think it's something that archives can think about in terms of exhibition, in terms of access, and so on. For me, engaged deconstruction of the work is what I have found more valuable with my students. But I think an important point to note is that it's different in some important way. The ethics to me are different between a working artist and an estate. It's perhaps easier for me to say I want to engage with Wallace's work because by engaging with his work I am not directing money towards him. And I think that again, it's a complicated question around the sort of commercial implications. And this goes back to some of the discussions about market that we had earlier. I do think that critical engagement with the idea of canon, there's that word again, canonization, sainthood, that engaging critically, and the more of these materials that are available and accessible, importantly, the better a conversation we can have with deeply engaged students. I don't think that polarizing the debate, I don't think that shutting down an archive or silencing a syllabus, I don't think that these are the answers. But the temptation is very much still there. And as I say, I think that as a reader, that's an absolutely valuable choice. That's a Caravaggio in the background. This is the important one for me is the second thing here. We don't love works of art because they're virtuous. I don't like things because they're good. To me, there's a risk of sanitizing cultural history if we choose to close down archives to make them, and by close down I don't mean sort of shutter, but to restrict access and so forth. And I say that in terms of also of critical work and of teaching. I think that it is the risk is that we sanitize, that we go by weather rather than climate. But I also, there is a less tangible risk if we apply these moral criteria to figures like Wallace, for example, that then when we seek the more diverse voices that are being discussed here, when we try to decolonize our curricula, when we try to decolonize our archival collections, that we do so on the basis of virtue instead of on the basis of significance, instead of on the basis of importance. And I think that is a future problem that bears consideration when we talk about collections. There's Finding Dory. There's a forced perspective GIF. I thought, with the idea of memory, I thought it was a nice one to have. So canon formation, as far as I'm concerned, is a form of cultural archiving. My sister, who is an archivist, would probably murder me for saying that, but there you are. As cultural expectations and practices shift, as that climate moves, this is very much what Stephen was talking about earlier, how do we respond as critics, as curators, as teachers, as scholars? How do we respond? Do we simply discard? Do we refocus? If we refocus, how do we refocus? Are we talking about content notes? Are we talking about exhibitions? Are we talking about forms of access? Are we talking about collections in dialogue? These are questions that I think will be long in the answering. And when I say discard, again, I don't mean like burn. I mean simply, so in my case, I would mean discard from a syllabus. My solution in general, objectivity, as someone observed earlier, is impossible. But in working towards accessibility and consciousness of context, I think that things like digitization can and location are worth considering. An archive can, I think, work with a classroom and with cultural commentary to mindfully consider these texts. In my case, I discuss Wallace's work in conversation with other voices, with typically more marginalized writers. So the questions that I ask, if we are disengaging from these problematic figures, how do we signal this? How do we talk about it without then engaging engaging in a sort of a shallow way with these figures? If we choose to engage, how do we choose? Do we choose content notes or content warnings? What are the discussion questions that we can set up? How do we prime and train and invite the next generation of scholars to think about these figures, to think about these questions? Reading and conversation is my go-to solution here. But there is a debating for the sake of it question as well. I'm going to leave it at that, but I think that as a scholar of text rather than of information as object, my questions are: how do we talk about this? How do we talk about this with our students? How do we talk about this with other scholars? As archivists, what can you and we do to scaffold the development of these conversations rather than to close them down? How do we avoid the veneration trap? That's a good title for a book. So how do we read the relationships that we see in the text? How do we read those alongside what we know of the life? And where do we draw the line from, as I've sort of demonstrated a little bit here, toxic masculinity in operation in a text to toxic masculinity in operation in a life that we're aware of and in the sort of curatorship of that life to the broader problems of social violence and toxic masculinity. So with that enormous question, I will leave you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here at the Henry Ransom Center and here on this panel, which I've come to understand is maybe the Outlier Panel. I'm neither an academic nor an archivist nor a curator, but I'm a museum educator. And I'll be speaking from my perspective as a museum educator and the strategies that we use at the Hammer Museum at UCLA to discuss works of art that have complicated histories or contexts. So thank you very much, Clare, for segueing me into this conversation. So most of us have inherited collections that we have to engage with in one way or another. In my opinion, we do a disservice to the public if we don't openly talk with them about the problematic issues surrounding our collections, whether it is a work of art by an artist accused of wrongdoing or a painting that perpetuates dominant narratives, usually white, patriarchal, and Western, at the expense of others, usually people of color and women. Rather than deinstalling objects, keeping them tucked in storage, or ignoring the problematic parts of an object's context in favor of safe topics of discussion, I believe it's much more useful to open up the channels of dialogue, especially when it's difficult. But how? How can we productively engage various audiences with art that explores problematic subject matter or art made by individuals accused of wrongdoing? How might we talk about work by Paul Gauguin? Of course, this is an artist who is a canonical pioneer of European modernism, celebrated for his powerful use of color, the decorative treatment of form, and symbolism imbued with spirituality. How do we talk about an artist who is also an individual whose patriarchal and colonialist privilege enabled him to undress, exploit, and marry Tahitian girls as young as 13, such as Teamana, his model, mistress, and housekeeper depicted here? His very subject matter depends on his ability to exploit female Polynesian girls as models. Bonjour, Monsieur Gauguin is in the Hammer's permanent collection, and I do enjoy incorporating the painting in tours because it is a useful teaching object for visitors of all ages. I might incorporate the painting in a tour that traces key developments in art history, or for younger audiences, the self-portrait is effective when exploring themes of identity and place. But what, if anything, should be said about the biography of Paul Gauguin in relation to this painting? Well, the painting was made before the artist travels to Tahiti. However, there are some interesting parallels that are relevant to mention. It was painted just 1 year after the artist left the south of France for a small town in Brittany, of which he wrote, quote, "I love Brittany. There I find the wild and the primitive." Scholar Abigail Solomon Goudreau points out that Brittany is Gauguin's, quote, "initial encounter with cultural otherness, a revivifying immersion in a more archaic, atavistic, and organic society." So bringing up this information, although not explicit in the painting itself, would be both relevant to this particular painting and also speak to a timely topic, one that all visitors would be familiar with, thereby connecting a work made over 100 years ago to a topic on the minds of audiences in the present day. In this moment, a groundswell of abused, formerly silenced voices have been finding agency through the collective Me Too movement. In October 2017, within 24 hours of a tweet by Alyssa Milano calling for those who are sexually assaulted or harassed to speak out, 4.7 million people around the world engaged in the Me Too conversations through posts and reactions. Since then, convicted and alleged accusers have been named in nearly every sector of society, from Hollywood and sports, from the arts world to the food industry. The visitors that are coming through our doors are bringing this knowledge into our institutions, whether we want to talk about it or not. As cultural institutions with responsibilities to the public, museums should be able to foster respectful and productive conversations about art with the public's diverse interests in mind. But how? Museum educators are experts in articulating connections between art and visitors' lives, but that hasn't always been a priority. For the first few decades of the gallery teaching profession, which began in the early 1900s, lectures and gallery talks were the most common educational offerings for adult visitors. Most museum instructors were trained in art history and essentially taught a watered-down version of university-level art history. These types of tours were one-way transmissions of information, with instructors positioned as revealers of knowledge. This type of pedagogical approach has been called pedagogy as transmission, and we now know from education studies that this is not the best way for people to learn, although here I am talking in a lecture style to all of you. In these images from the 1960s, the physical separation of the instructor from the student signals both a physical distance and a clear distinction between who has the authority to speak in these spaces and who should just be listening quietly. By the 1970s, museum instructors began shifting from serving as transmitters of information to a visitor-centered paradigm of museum practice that elevates the interests of the museum-going public and proactively invites visitors' interpretation to make space for voices, many of whom may see the museum as a rarefied space, one that they are not smart enough, nor worldly enough, nor, in worst cases, not white enough to enter. This visitor-centered approach is grounded in pedagogical practices that acknowledge systems of power and privilege, such as constructivism, a theory in which knowledge is constructed by individuals who each bring their own knowledge and experiences to communities of discourse. New understandings are developed collectively. Knowledge is actively and always being produced by many, rather than simply transmitted by a few. And here I'll just quickly point out the shift in the physical position, with educators standing with or near visitors and looking at the art together. Although a useful and effective strategy, constructivism does not do enough to be responsive to our audiences. In a tour I led for blind and low vision veterans last year, the constructivist model of dialogue activated through visual evidence, of course, is not going to work. Moreover, constructivism doesn't do enough to decenter the dominant narratives that museums have reified, narratives that tend to be Western-centric, colonialist, and predominantly male. Educators have embraced culturally relevant pedagogy, or a more proactive version, culturally sustaining pedagogy, with the acknowledgement that museums have not historically been neutral spaces where every voice has equal weight. In culturally relevant pedagogy, we encourage a critique of dominant power structures and decenter those narratives in favor of our visitors' cultures. For museums to be more socially responsive, what scholar Dana Klechka refers to as the post-museum, we must respond to important community issues through dialogue with art museum collections and the local community. And that means giving communities the time and space to stand up and tell their own stories, and if they can't, then we can help to amplify their voices. But how? Let's return to Bonjour, Monsieur, Gauguin. In Tours at the Hammer, we usually open a discussion of a work of art by inviting viewers to look at the work closely for a few quiet moments. This gives visitors a chance to engage with the work on their own terms. Then we might ask an open-ended question such as, I invite you to share your initial observations, or what captures your attention? A question designed to prioritize visitors' observations first and open up the floor to any possible direction for a conversation. When I say any possible direction, we really have to be ready for what a visitor might say. For example, one visitor told an educator that she thinks it's really creepy that this work is on display at the Hammer, given that she knows about Gauguin's transgressions in Tahiti. So what's the best way to handle a comment like that? One method I employ is a framework called CARE. Clarify, assess, recontextualize, and elevate is the acronym, but it's not showing up. Oh, there it is. First I would clarify the visitor who has just expressed that this is creepy with a question such as, could you share more about this feelings of creepiness? Or are you suggesting that the Hammer should deinstall this painting? Then I would take a moment to assess based on the answer. How is the group reacting? Do I feel safe and equipped to respond? And let's say I'm ready to further this conversation, so I will recontextualize. Now, I could say the reason this work is on display at the Hammer is because it is part of the original collection of our founder, Dr. Armand Hammer. If I responded that way, would I truly be taking into account what the visitor is really interested in talking about? The visitor's comment reflects a legitimate concern about an individual who may be celebrated in the Western art canon, venerated, but who, if alive today, would surely be exposed to the Me Too movement, castigated, and possibly imprisoned. Another response could be in the form of an explanation to all those in a tour. What this visitor is referring to is the artist's travels to Polynesia, where he made some of the most well-known paintings of Tahitian females, and in the process exploited them and married three of them, one as young as 13. This painting was made prior to his travels to Tahiti. He had just moved to a small town in Brittany called Le Poldu, where he was attracted to the rural landscape and traditional dress of the region, particularly peasant women, which you can see in this woman's clothing. In Brittany, he got a taste of an unchanging rural world, a world outside of the bourgeois norms that he dismissed. So this is in some ways a precursor to the kind of work and lifestyle that he became notorious for. Okay, so that explanation may be a decent response that recontextualizes the visitor's comment. But does it elevate the conversation? Is it socially responsive? Does it build awareness of the constructs that justified colonialism and dominance over people of color? Not really. What if I added this to the conversation? Gauguin saw himself as a savage and had an appetite for depicting what he deemed as savage. Of the Breton women and children that he painted, he wrote, quote, "I try to put into these desolate figures the savageness I see in them, and that is also in me," end quote. He abandoned his wife and children in France to pursue encounters in places he deemed as primitive and with those he considered savage. Although in the past his reprehensible behavior has been overlooked in favor of appreciating his work for its own merits, thankfully it is now well known that Gauguin's Western colonialist and patriarchal privilege enabled him to behave in an abominable way to exploit young girls of color. And honestly, in my personal opinion, I have trouble viewing Gauguin's work in the same way knowing about this behavior, but I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk about it to build awareness. What if we said that in the museum space? A bit more transparent and honest, and also connecting to our visitors. Just to give you more information about the CARE framework, here are some prompts that could be used within this within these four different words. And this is, by the way, a useful framework for everyday life. If anybody has an issue or maybe a microaggression, maybe in a cab ride, it's happened to me, someone will say, "Oh, I'm surprised you speak English so well." So I can clarify, are you suggesting that because of the color of my skin? I can assess whether or not I feel safe to respond. I can recontextualize by saying, I'm Filipino-American, I was born in the States, and actually Filipinos in the Philippines learn how to speak English. And I can elevate by saying, "Thank you very much for listening to my perspective." Oops. Here's another example of a painting. Oh, no, that's right. So I thought this quote was great, and it captured my ambivalent feelings as well about Gauguin, something that I said I do love to teach with, but also have challenges while teaching. Here's another example of a painting that is both beautiful and troubling, a 19th century painting of Salome dancing before Herod by Gustave Moreau. This painting depicts the biblical story of the Judean princess Salome dancing before her mother Herodias and her stepfather King Herod. As the story goes, Herodias was angry at John the Baptist for criticizing her marriage to King Herod, who was a brother of her first husband who had been murdered. She had her daughter Salome dance for the king, and because she danced so well, she was told she could have whatever she wanted, and of course, she had asked for the head of John the Baptist. When talking about this work with visitors, often someone will mention how exotic Salome looks, how the setting looks Middle Eastern. They might say there's a feeling of sensuality or mystery or danger, which are all common stereotypes of women from the Middle East. If a visitor describes Salome as exotic or dangerous, after going through the clarify and assess steps of my CARE framework, I might recontextualize the conversation this way. It's interesting that you use the words exotic and dangerous to describe the female. I think you may be picking up on some of the interests as well as the biases of the artist in his representation of this biblical story. The notion of a femme fatale was a popular trope in 19th century literature and art. Femme fatale characters appeared in Moreau's works prior to this painting, and his interest continued with the seductress version of Salome. And there's this panther, a feline predator in the bottom right corner, also a symbol of lust, and the man, the executioner, holding a sword. So there's a good bit of danger referenced in this painting. But what can we make of connecting danger and an exotic otherness? Now, Salome was a popular story for artists at the time, but other artists chose to paint Salome in more naturalist ways and in Western clothing. But Moreau was captivated by what many Western Europeans during the 19th century considered to be exotic. He wanted to create a palais fantastique. Individual elements were sketched from photographs of Etruscan, Roman, Egyptian, Indian, Islamic, and Chinese art and architecture, collected, fused together, rendered, flattened, and rendered as all individual cultures were flattened to a general sense of the Orient. during the artist's time, the Orient was portrayed as the opposite of Western reason, timeless and opulent, but also a place of degeneracy and violence. Moreau exaggerated cultural differences with a mishmash of Orientalist motifs and depicted Salome dripping in lavish jewels in an otherworldly, gravity-defying, unnatural pose. All right, that's a lot of contextualizing. So to elevate the conversation, I might say the rising popularity of Orientalist painting in the 19th century was closely associated with the peak of European colonialist expansion. And we now think of Orientalism as a strategy for political domination of the East. Unfortunately, we now have a lot of stereotypes in the media that have stemmed in part by Orientalist painters who have exaggerated cultural differences. It's a good reminder to us, looking at historical paintings with contemporary eyes, that we should look at works like this, however beautiful, with a critical lens. Artists, just like all of us, have biases that impact our decision-making, and just because they are brilliant doesn't mean they're off the hook. Okay. Oh, there's a detail. That's beautiful. So both Moreau and Gauguin's paintings are part of the Arm & Hammer's collection, works of art from the 16th through the 20th century. In addition to Moreau and Gauguin, we have works by other giants in the Eurocentric, male-dominated art historical canon. Although the Hammer was originally built to showcase a private collection of historical paintings, the Hammer has grown to become a major institution dedicated to contemporary arts and culture, which I'm very thankful for. We have a particular emphasis on Los Angeles artists and emerging or under-recognized talents. So when we talk about paintings by Gauguin or Moreau, we do not have to limit our conversation to art by artists who exoticize and homogenize communities of color. Equally as important as providing the space to critique these historical paintings is ensuring we provide space to discuss paintings by contemporary artists of color. If students visit one art museum during their whole school career and they do not see themselves reflected in the art or the staff, and if the art aligns with dominant white narratives that marginalize their communities, we are likely doing more harm than good. I'm always concerned about engaging with a diverse representation of artists at the Hammer, and further, I'm excited about the dialogue that can transpire when you spend time with Gauguin and then turn to works that are on view in our contemporary collections show called Dirty Protest, selections from the Hammer Contemporary Collection. Like Gauguin, Angelica Crosby, whose work is in the show, straddles different geographic locations. Unlike Gauguin, her paintings do not represent an unfamiliar other. Crosby speaks from her lived experience with dual allegiance to Nigeria, where she was born, and the U.S., where she has lived since 1999, and where she married an American. Her paintings represent the liminal space that she inhabits simultaneously. When discussing the representation of oneself, it is interesting to compare these two paintings. The distance between Gauguin and the literally marginalized peasant woman at the edge of the frame and separated by rustic fence is in stark contrast to the intimacy between an empowered-looking Crosby embracing her kneeling husband. It's also interesting to consider Moreau's representation in conjunction with a painting by Tala Madani called Dirty Protest, from which the exhibition takes its name. Tala Madani's painting features babies who are fascinated by their own excrement, using it as art material for a kind of protest. The painting resists one particular interpretation. Perhaps the babies are turning waste into something beneficial or defiling their environment. One interpretation that I particularly like is how it operates as a comedic critique of toxic masculinity, as the babies are given free rein to act inappropriately, to piss and stain their surroundings. Now, Madani is an Iranian-American artist born in Tehran. She is not fond of critics examining her work through the lens of her Iranian background. And I think it's useful to bring up Madani's work in conversation or juxtaposition with Moreau, because whereas one painting further stereotypes of a homogenized Orient, Madani reminds us that when individuals from the Middle East are telling their own stories, their work cannot be so narrowly boxed in. Okay. And I want to end with this quote, which I'll just take the time to read because I do think it's important. Museums, in their cultural roles of memory keeper, conscience, and healer, have an obligation to provoke reflection, rethinking, and rebalancing. Museums can help us deal with the dark side of history, not just emotionally and personally, but in a way that helps us build a just and equitable society despite our legacy of theft and violence, from the American Alliance of Museums. So I thought that was a really powerful statement for them to put out in their Trends Watch report. And I will end there.
Well, thank you three so much for those really rich and thought-provoking presentations. It's interesting to think about connections between them and other differences. I mean, and something that strikes me immediately is the way that you're all engaging with different audiences. I mean, even in the museum, you're struggling to deal with people of different ages and families and schools. Clare and Anne, you're speaking to scholars, to students. And I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more how the different audiences that you speak to at different moments might shape how you engage with some of these materials.
So I can start just because I do this like every day. Sometimes I'm thinking about a work that could be fairly complex and multi-layered and maybe inappropriate, but I sometimes have to figure out a way to make it work with a school group or a family program. If not explicitly, it's in the space. They see it next to the Gauguin. They're going to go and experience this one work. So I think one strategy that I use is really getting to the heart of what this work is about. So just let's say for example, Tala Madani's painting that I ended with. So, that is a work that does deal with toxic masculinity. It is maybe not a pleasant painting to look at from the perspective of thinking of excrement. However, I do think any age level could have a sense of understanding about the freedom and free reign with which these babies are playing with something that they shouldn't be playing with. And you scale up that conversation based on the audience and try to get at to the value or the sort of nugget of meaning that can be translated to different types of visitors.
I think I'm, as you say, working with scholars and with students. One of the things that you get with Wallace, teaching Wallace particularly, is there's the Wallace fan stereotype, and I'm going to trade in stereotypes for just a second, is a young white man, typically middle class, well educated, who really, and again this word venerates Wallace, and there is a kind of that fanaticism almost that you get with really dedicated young fans of any writer, and to sort of unpack what the assumptions that they are making, these young men I very often have in my class, while at the same time trying to amplify the experiences of women in the class who are responding to very, very different undertones and overtones, and indeed just plain old tones in the same text, and to try and balance those. To try and balance and honor both of those experiences and both of those voices. My tactic is not unlike yours. My tactic is close reading, is to ask students to focus on how a text is operating on them, and to try and explore the assumptions that they're bringing. This is within a classroom, but with Wallace, you also at the moment have this sort of broader cultural dialogue. And I think somebody asked me how I knew or why I would say that Wallace is an important cultural figure, and I think it's because there are so many people who know what Infinite Jest is but haven't read it. It was in the Gilmore Girls, for example, and Castle. I think if anybody watched that show, there was a whole episode based on Infinite Jest, which was pretty weird. So these are cultural touchstones that people are familiar with, but perhaps not don't necessarily have knowledge of. And again, a lot of canonical artists would be similar. That you go, oh yeah, that's a Gauguin or whatever, without bringing an awareness of the background. So to try and gently, where possible, the the structure that you use, the care structure, is a really nice. I'm really trying to figure out if I can make that into my name. I'm like, listen, something's got to be an L in there. But that's a very useful way of. Thank you. That's a very useful way, I think, of trying to orient yourself in the conversation, where your position. What the most useful way of engaging with the whoever you're speaking to, and the multiplicity of perspectives. I also have for those of you who aren't particularly familiar with Ireland, it's an extraordinarily non-diverse place still. It's diversity. Ireland is historically a nation of emigrants rather than immigrants, and that's beginning to change. But my classrooms are still predominantly white and middle class, predominantly young and able-bodied. So, in a way, I'm sorry, I'm conscious I'm going on. In a way, I'm working to disrupt the same kind of the same kind of categories of privilege within the lives of these students as well. So it can be, there's a sort of a different conversation. It's not that they don't see themselves, it's perhaps that they identify too readily with these positions. So that's another conversation.
I think I'll address your question a slightly different way, picking up on Theresa's starting point of this is the Outlier Panel. And when you said that, I thought it was a reference to identity. It's like women, queers, people of color on the panel. And I do think the curation of who's here across the 2 days is interesting, because I think some care went into trying to create a multiplicity of perspectives, and then it's interesting to think where those come from. But in fact, you said outlier, meaning we are not archivists, curators, et cetera. And I think that's significant too, like how and why might those map together, the identity questions and the sort of like the demographic identity questions and the professional identity questions, because I do think there's a reason why I, as a scholar, have found myself pulled into or wanting to engage with the actual practice of both archival collecting and, I will also add, exhibition. So the creation of public cultures around those collections, which also I have found kind of in my amateur way, entering these spaces becomes another thing that sometimes I get pushback about, that is archive, museum, not the same thing. But if it's the case, it was mentioned in the first panel, that part of the, if archival collections are to take responsibility, and museums as well, for their publics, then we end up having to do a very different kind of collaborative work. And so what you saw here, I think, is also a set of interesting issues around pedagogy. And I will say I felt affirmed in my choice to use not just one case, but a strategy of juxtaposition, because that final, the slide where you're putting Moreau together with the contemporary artist, a little bit goes a long way to completely transform what the canonical survey looks like. And, I could speak to my work going to the Blanton. I think actually Rachel Winston will be able to address this too with respect to the Black Diaspora Archive here at UT. It's not enough, for example, for me to take my students to the HRC. I have to take them to the Benson, and they have to see, for example, the Gloria Ansel-Jewett collection, or to know about the work of Charles White, which we have. The Gordon White Building is our home for African and African diaspora studies of Mexican American Latino studies here on the campus. It's named after Ted Gordon's dad, Edmund Gordon, and also Charles White, the artist. There was just a show at the Benson of the Gordon collections that include White's work. The Blanton did not want to collect that work that was in the family's collections. Charles White just had a major retrospective at the Whitney Museum was the Whitney?
It's at LACMA right now.
MoMA, sorry. That included materials from what are now UT's collections. So change is happening, but it's slow. And it is important to live inside of the contradiction or the tension between critique and veneration. I'm sorry, but I've been doing that for my entire career, like for 30 years. There's been a tradition within feminism of inhabiting that contradiction. So there are resources to draw on in doing this work, and I'm really happy to see, work that I've passionately tried to, be a part of for a long career, now reaching into the public. And so I do want to be part of those conversations as we talk about how we're teaching, what we're exhibiting, and just to take it back one step to archival collections, I've had interesting discussions with archivists about cataloging and about the presumption that that somehow, for example, finding aids or other descriptions are neutral, that it's the archivist's job just to collect and not judge and let the scholars do the work of critique or analysis. I think we got to rethink that. I think we do need finding aids that tell us more about where collections came from, that can help us to understand some of the tricky tracks of how things got collected. There's a bunch of stuff that could happen, so I'm really excited for the conversation because I think we have a lot to contribute to one another, and that it's really important that we don't police the boundaries amidst those professional identities, while also respecting the incredible work that the expertise, exactly.
I think that idea of juxtaposition seems to be one that we're all coming back to, and is something that I guess is relevant, or extremely relevant for the sort of the physical and digital. Post-curatorial, that's such a, I don't know anything about archiving, I'm sorry, but that was a fascinating idea, the sort of the multiplicity of locations, the multiplicity of media, and the juxtaposition of the opportunities for juxtaposition of those things. So I teach one of Wallace's stories, The Suffering Channel, which is a 9/11 story, kind of. I teach alongside Parcha Stakakpour, who's an Iranian-American writer, her The Last Illusion, which is similarly trades in kind of mythic structures and visual art. And again, as you say, it's a little goes a long way, and that really sort of changes the way readers and students and scholars kind of think. So I think that juxtaposition seems to be the word of the moment.
I have one more question, and then we'll open it up in the interest of time. But I was something that came up in each of your presentations was also the issue of silence. And I was struck by the ways that silence can be resistant, but it could also be protective, and like your decision not to show the image of Robert Lynch. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about ways that that silence might be used productively in some moments, either for protection or resistance or some other type of goal.
It's an interesting question. The story that I showed you, the brief part from, some of you may have come across these stories before, but they're the interviews of the title brief interviews with hideous men are conducted by a woman who we never hear. She's silenced in the story, or in all of the stories, and she's represented just by the letter Q, capital letter Q, sometimes with a period after it, sometimes with an ellipsis, sometimes without either, sometimes with a period and an ellipsis. So it's kind of Beckettian use of silence, of directed silence, and the story as a whole is modelled in some ways on the myth of Philomela, who was raped and whose rapist tore her tongue out to prevent. She wove her story into a tapestry to accuse it was her brother-in-law. I think the classicists among you might correct me. So the idea, and the story in question is a double silencing. So it's this man speaking to the interviewer, whom we don't hear, about a woman who has told him this story. So he's appropriating and telling her story. And so there are a lot of kinds of silence. But one of the arguments that I have made is that final decline into the rant that the narrator goes into is brought on by a resistant form of silence, that we don't see what is said to him, and so we are, as readers, asked to direct that conversation ourselves, and it's a rich space for interpretation. I think I've had students write the other side of the interview, write the interviewer's questions, which has been really productive. So I think that silence and space can be enormously powerful.
I'll just say it's interesting, silence as a metaphor versus silence as a literal phenomenon. And it makes me think about another aspect of my work with archives, my kind of critical work with archives, comes out of the experience of doing oral history work, actually at Columbia, which is a key site, Butler Library, for a Center for Oral History that's also had sometimes a somewhat contested relation to rare books and manuscripts. So oral history's often been the poor stepchild of, what are considered more prestigious forms of archival collection. And but it's an interesting. I came to it out of an interest in archives of trauma and testimony. And so, what did it mean to actually interview someone? What would they tell you or not tell you? And to have a healthy respect for the right of refusal to testify, even as there's also an urgency. So I've learned a lot from that, and then tried to take it perhaps in a more metaphorical sense into paper and documentary archives. And where I'm especially interested in the question is, sort of knowing what I know, or keeping in mind, again, this ambivalent relation to the question of archiving or documentation from the oral record. What would that mean for exhibition? Like, how do you take silence into exhibition? For me, it's just become a really interesting practical question. I have a lot to say about it as a scholar who can just operate critically, to sit back and say, there's the silence, or there's the not said, or the not seen. But I've definitely been drawn to the practice of exhibition or curation in order to strategize on how we could honor that question of absence or silence.
I think of silence in different ways, and I think it's important to think about the reason behind the silence. I use silence as a tool in tours to sort of have a moment for people to think about what's being talked about, to look at the work. But it's important for me as an educator to think about who is silent in this space, and is it because they're feeling silenced because of the space, or if they are silent because they're taking something in, they're reflecting, or they simply just don't want to engage in that way, and to just be as good of a listener as possible. So I do think Clare could work. Not just with my ear, but also to kind of acknowledge body language and try to lift people up that are feeling silenced for some reason and just want to speak but are not able to for whatever reason. So that is something that I really look out for when working with visitors.
We have a few more minutes, so I think we should open it up to the audience and see if people have questions.
So I have a question for Clare. You made the distinction between the reader and the critic, and their different responsibilities for example, for performance, and but where does taste play into that? As a critic, maybe personal taste doesn't really matter for you to kind of do your job, but what about a reader who may have an internal conflict, particularly if the work doesn't reflect the personal failings of the creator? What would you say to a student who just really likes this writing, even if there are, a lot of issues with the creator?
I think that we love what we love, and you can't unlove something. One of the conversations that's being had at the moment is Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's music was instrumental in the development of identity for thousands and thousands of people, and you cannot unpick that importance, and you have to honor that importance as well. I think that your quote about something being beautiful and troubling at the same time is it's so important. I actually think that these are very valuable conversations, because it's important that we learn to live with ambivalence. There is no solution to this, I don't think. There is no answer. Sometimes you are going to love something that is freighted with problems. You may know it when you love it. You may know it afterwards. You may know it in advance. But we don't love things because they're good. We don't love things because they're virtuous. We love them because we love them. There's an alchemy in it. And you can make practical and moral justifications, certainly. for the things that you love, the decisions that you make. But the decisions that we make, aesthetic and ethical and moral and personal, are not usually practically guided. They're not usually fully logical. If they were, things would be a little less mad, possibly. So I think that the answer to that student, and I get this with students at home, and they come and they say, but I love this book, but it's so awful. And you love what you love. Think about what implications and what assumptions it is scaffolding, what it's supporting. Approach your own taste with a critical eye as much as you can. And if I am succeeding as an educator, if I'm succeeding as a scholar, it is in asking people to critique their own assumptions rather than teaching them this is a Marxist reading, this is a feminist reading. I ask them to think about what their own readings are. They don't all enjoy it. I've had some pretty excoriating feedback on that. But I think that at the end of the day, you can love something and know that it's been created by someone you do not respect or like. And that's okay. That's okay. There's value and difficulty in all of these things, and ambivalence is not to be shied away from. I think that's really important. So thank you for that question, and that somewhat kind of, oh, Captain, my Captain answer.
Thanks for a great talk. I'm curious, in terms of the interpretation of Gauguin, how much of the interpretation of the culture at that time also comes into play in terms of the analysis of the artist. So age of consent laws in France until 1945 was 13. Today it's 15. Marriage is 18. And so looking at that historically into the perspective, how much of that is presented in terms of the presentations of the artists, whatever culture they're in, and the historical, around it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's very important to understand the historical context of sexual predators. I think that, at the end of the day, when we're looking at this work with contemporary eyes, and we have like 10 minutes to talk about a work of art, part of what I'm thinking about is, what am I prioritizing saying? There's so much to say about that work, and even just the way that I talked about it now is just a fraction of what I know about that work. And certainly that is important, but in the moment of honoring a visitor's response that is deeply related to their concern about a pedophile, then I'm going to go there, I think. I'm going to make that choice to talk about that in the way that I talked about it right now. Had it been a different question, maybe, if that was asked point blank, that question, I would certainly respond in that way.
Any other questions from the audience?
There's one in the back there.
Hi, I'm Curtis Small from the University of Delaware Special Collections. So in your presentation about Gauguin, I wondered, given the way that our perspectives are being broadened and changing through developments like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, disability rights, and so on and so forth, what has been your thinking, or the thinking among colleagues, about framing exhibits in a way that injects these newer perspectives and the impetus to decolonize and so on in the way that exhibits themselves are conceived, so that, I saw the Gauguin exhibit, I remember, that might have been at the Med some years ago, that had information that, brought in a perspective that allowed me to see how complicit it was with colonialism, but not so much the gender part. If it had been framed differently, it would have been a, more fruitful experience. I'm just wondering how, you and your colleagues are thinking about this going forward.
Right. So I'm not a curator, so I don't have control of or work on the framing of the exhibition. So I see my job as finding the connections, the juxtapositions, the bridges between the people that I'm talking to, the work, the curatorial vision, and the artist that made it. So I'm not really answering your question in that it's not really my place to talk about the framing of the exhibition from a curatorial standpoint. I will say that there was a Gauguin exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago last year, and they really didn't touch this at all. And my colleagues in education that were working with that show found it really challenging. It wasn't in the labels. They weren't. They just felt like, how much can they bring? And so I think it depends on the institution, how willing they are to go through a decolonizing effort to be more transparent about what they're doing. And it really is institution by institution whether or not they're choosing to frame exhibitions in that way.
It's something you see with curricula as well, that you've such limited space. You've such limited space and such limited time in an exhibition and a space. You've such limited space in a curriculum. How do you cover? You can't cover everything. I suppose the best you can hope for is to give enough stimulus that people can go and seek, go and make their own knowledge and their own judgments as much as and to support that journey as much as you can is my I would from the literary from the curriculum side.
I'll just add, too, that one aspect of the work that I've been doing for my current research on new collaborations between community-based archives and more mainstream institutions also has to do with I've ended up working with a lot of artists who curate very creatively in the archives. And so I think this is an important question because I don't think this can be fully addressed with a recontextualization that takes the form of just more text and labeling. This is why the live encounter of the kind you're describing is really important. But I think there's, again, a lot we can do to keep pushing that envelope. Some of it maybe does build on maybe my efforts as a syllabus constructor, rethinking the survey, but also in some cases tossing the survey and having, again, there's a lot of resources we have to draw on in doing this work. But I have been particularly interested in artist curation. I've just been doing some work with the Canadian Indigenous artist Kent Monkman, who did an amazing show called Shame and Prejudice, a story of resilience, in which he curated his own work together with historical paintings that are extremely difficult to look at, but not being censored, being brought into play. It was really eye-opening for me to see how much more we need to do to bust the confines of the conventional exhibition. And then I do think, for me, there are some blockbuster exhibitions that are just really unreconstructed, and maybe that will go.
Yes, you spoke about how kind of individually we all have to kind of go through our process of separating the artist and and our own opinions and their life. What do you think we as collectors? What is our responsibility as far as, particularly in this the Me Too movement right now and various moments? But I noticed in the Wallace papers, it doesn't seem like there's much personal material. It does seem to be focusing primarily on his writing. So one, I wonder if that was a conscious decision in order to just focus on the literary aspect and not the private life. But in archives, so often those are, particularly in the literary world, it's hard to separate. So I guess my question is kind of if you could just speak to the privacy issues, and I know that Anne talked about this with hers, a privacy issue for people who might have been, for a better word, victims of the lifestyle that the artists lived, and what our responsibility might be in handling that.
That's a really important question, I think. I said at the beginning that my work is largely non-archival. I actually, when I was writing my book, I actually didn't have the opportunity to visit the archives, so my work was exclusively, my book was exclusively based on the published work. But I want to pick up on something that you said right at the beginning of your question, the idea of separating the artist from the art. I think that this is a really complicated, I don't think you can do that. You know, I also don't think that collapsing the artist's behavior into the art is necessarily terribly productive either. And I think that it goes back to that sort of that sense of really productive ambivalence. But I do think that it is something that as collectors, as readers, it's important to consider that element as well. And the earlier question about loving a piece of work that's been produced by someone you have ethical problems with, moral problems with, I think that what our responsibility, such as it is to construct an interpretation on the basis of all of these things, on the basis of our own responses, and on the basis of our changing and evolving cultural interpretations of the material, but also the behavior, and then to take that understanding out back into a contemporary culture and to say, yes, there is something of value here, regardless of, or not regardless of, but in dialogue with something that is troubling and something that is problematic. And what can I do? Where can I find the value that I see in this in the work of marginalized artists, for example? Can I find the style that I like here? Can I find what I respond to here in work that has been marginalized, that has been underrepresented, that has been less considered? That's one way. So this juxtaposition again. I'm not a biographical reader as a general rule, but I think that drawing that line from individual behavior to published text to considering broader trends of social violence and the sort of sanctioned ideas of masculinity, which is what I was picking up on, and the intersections between masculinity and economics, the intersections between masculinity and race, the intersections between masculinity and mobility, all of these nexuses of conflict. I think that you can draw lines, and they are productive lines of inquiry. And as collectors, it's our responsibility to do that. But it doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice the work that we love. It just means that we have to love it and know that that's complicated, I think. Possibly. I don't know.
I could add there that part of what our examples were, and some of your examples were as well, are artists and makers and writers who are deceased. And when we are, I think there's a distinction that I think needs to be made too about when someone is alive, is if we're choosing to mount an exhibition or choosing to acquire a collection of a living person that is currently in controversy and is accused of misdeeds, what is that doing for an institution to make that decision to do it in this moment? And I think that's a different question. And it's something that, for example, the National Gallery of Art was supposed to have a retrospective of Chuck Close's work, or maybe a major exhibition, maybe not a retrospective. And he had been accused of sexual harassment, and they decided to postpone it. And I thought that was whether or not you feel that was a good decision or a bad decision, I think it was a very different kind of decision, because this artist is still alive, could benefit from the exhibition's heightening of his voice, of the monetary connections between an exhibition and his financial ability to grow from it in the middle of this controversy.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. And not just living, but continuing to work as well. I think that still an artist who's still producing, that is a very different conversation, I think.
I mean, if I could just add, I think these are key questions, and it would be interesting to keep wrestling with them across the next day, because I think it is again about an analysis that can benefit from, I think, this more complicated sense of ambivalence of. I would hardly endorse you cannot make a clean separation of art and artist, but even framing it in that way might be problematic, in part because we're not dealing just with individuals. We are dealing with pervasive structures of sexism, racism, et cetera. So even just the basic, like, it's not about people and individual intention. It is about systemic structures. So there's many opportunities to have been thinking about this for a while now. I'm glad that the conversation is sort of catching up. But if it only turns on individuals and their, deeds, I think we miss some of the complexity of the fact that we are, likely dealing with structures of sexism inside people's lives, whatever they did, and that's the work we can do through careful, non-hagiographic inquiry. And I say this as someone who's worked on white femininity. It's like women's hands aren't clean either. I mean, or maybe it's because of that, and also LGBTQ stuff. So at one point I wanted to also insert is that that's a place to look at the complexity of the question of inclusion, because the HRC does not need to reach out to include queer content. It's everywhere because of where that is present in elite forms of cultural production. So that also takes you to this area that's more complicated than just in, out, good, bad. So we got to live inside that complexity. And then, yes, I'm not the curator that has to decide if I'm going to put the money out to buy a particular collection. And those are difficult decisions for people to be making, especially in this moment right now. Again, I think we need to have collaborative conversations because the answers are not clear.
Well, thank you very much. We're out of time.